March 1, 1476. The plain outside the town of Toro, Zamora Province, Castile. Nobody won this battle. That is the first thing you need to understand about the engagement that decided the War of Castilian Succession, that it was, militarily speaking, a draw. Fernando's cavalry defeated the Portuguese cavalry on the right flank. The Portuguese infantry under the Crown Prince João held its ground and retreated in order. The two armies withdrew. Nobody pursued. The battlefield was left to the dead of both sides. By every conventional measure of what constitutes a military victory, the Battle of Toro was inconclusive. And within 6 months, it had ended the war entirely. Because Fernando understood something that Alfonso V of Portugal, with his larger army and his official claim and his French ally and his papal dispensation and everything else that was supposed to make him the winner of this conflict, never managed to understand. The battle was not the point. The story you told about the battle was the point. Fernando sent riders in every direction before the last Portuguese soldier had left the field. They carried a single message, worded carefully, repeated identically. The Portuguese had been defeated. Castile had won. The Queen's army had prevailed. It was not precisely true. It was not precisely false. It was exactly true enough to make the Castilian nobles who had been waiting to see which side was going to win, who had been hedging their commitments, maintaining diplomatic contact with both parties, doing what powerful men in unstable political situations always do, make their decision. They chose Isabel. And that is how a battle that nobody won became the battle that decided everything. She had no army when the war started. Her treasury was empty. Half the nobles of Castile were waiting to see if she would survive before committing to her. Portugal invaded with a force 3 times her size. And she won. Not because she was lucky. Because she understood something about power that her enemies never did. Subscribe, like the video, and let's go through every year of this war. May 1475. Portuguese troops crossed the Castilian border. Alfonso V of Portugal, who had married his niece Juana la Beltranilla, Enrique IV's disputed daughter, in a ceremony specifically designed to legitimize his claim to Castile, invaded with a force that dwarfed anything Isabel could put in the field. He had the numbers. He had the Portuguese army, professional and battle-hardened. He had the support of Louis XI of France, who had his own reasons for not wanting a unified Iberian power on his southern border. He had the official backing of a papal dispensation, later revoked but present at the start, and the endorsement of the most powerful noble families in Castile, who preferred a Juana they could manage to an Isabel they could not. What he did not have was aggression. This is the detail that Fernando del Pulgar and Alonso de Palencia both note in their chronicles, and that modern historians have confirmed through the military record. Alfonso V was cautious to the point of strategic paralysis. He advanced. He stopped. He negotiated when he should have pressed. He paused when momentum was everything. He had an army that could have crushed the Isabellan forces in the first months of the war, before they had consolidated, before the propaganda machine had started running, before Isabel had found her footing as a wartime queen. He didn't use it. Isabel used the time he gave her. The first problem was money. She didn't have any. The Castilian treasury had been systematically stripped by Enrique IV's court, and what remained was insufficient to fund a war against Portugal and France simultaneously. Her solution was ruthless and immediate. She confiscated the silver of the Castilian churches, promising to repay it when the war was won. She did repay it years later. But in May 1475 she took the silver without waiting for permission and used it to pay soldiers. The second problem was the nobility. The great noble houses of Castile, the Mendoza, the Velasco, the Enriquez, the Alvarez de Toledo, had not yet committed. They were watching. Isabel moved through Castile personally, meeting with each house, negotiating, promising, threatening where necessary, presenting herself not as a supplicant asking for loyalty but as the rightful queen receiving what was owed to her. The distinction mattered. She was not begging. She was collecting a debt. The third problem was the war itself. Here is the thing that the chronicles record about Isabel and the war, and that most histories of this period fail to emphasize properly. She was there. Not in the palace receiving reports. Not in the capital managing the administration from safety. There. On the roads, in the winter, in the mud, moving between sieges and councils and negotiations with the physical presence of a commander who understood that being seen was itself a military act. Fernando del Pulgar records a journey she made in 1475, during the siege of the castle of Burgos, when she received intelligence that the castle's commander was in secret negotiations with the Portuguese. She covered 14 leagues without dismounting, 56 kilometers on horseback in a single day's riding, arrived before dawn in Leon, secured the fortress, installed a loyal commander, attended to the administration of the city, and returned. 14 leagues without dismounting. The chronicler notes that she did this despite all the impediments that normally prevent women from traveling the roads. He means this as a compliment. What it actually reveals is a woman who understood that the war was not going to be won from a comfortable chair, and who was physically willing to do what that understanding required. She was 24 years old and pregnant during parts of this campaign. Her daughter Juana, later known to history as Juana la Loca, but that is a later story, was born in November 1479 at the war's end. The pregnancy did not stop her traveling. In 1479, with the war's final negotiations underway in Trujillo, her advisors urged her to leave the frontier city for a safer location. The situation was difficult, the supply lines uncertain, the military outcome still technically unresolved. Isabel's response was preserved by Alonso de Palencia and has been quoted by every historian of her reign since. "I have decided to remain here until I see the end of the war we are making, or of the peace we are negotiating," she stayed. March 1, 1476. Alfonso V had been besieging Zamora, a strategically critical city on the Duero River, whose castle had been taken by Portuguese forces. Fernando arrived with a relief force. The Portuguese army moved to intercept him on the plain south of the town of Toro. The forces met in the late afternoon. Fernando commanded the Castilian cavalry personally. The engagement was fierce and fast, cavalry against cavalry on the flat Castilian plain, the spring mud making every horse's step uncertain, the light fading as the battle developed. Fernando's right wing broke through the Portuguese cavalry opposite it and drove it from the field. The Portuguese left wing, under the Crown Prince João, held against the Castilian attack and withdrew in good order. When the dust settled, both sides claimed victory. Both sides had grounds for their claim. The field was not decisively held by either army. Then Fernando sent his riders. The news that spread across Castile was not, the battle was inconclusive. The news was that the Portuguese had been driven from the field, which the Portuguese cavalry on one flank had been. The news spread faster than Alfonso V could counter it. The Portuguese king, who had watched his cavalry routed on one flank and his infantry hold on another, understood that he had lost the narrative before he could establish his own. The psychological effect was immediate and decisive. Noble houses that had been hedging their commitments began to choose sides. They chose Isabel. The Portuguese army, which had been deep in Castile for almost a year, found its supply lines increasingly contested and its local allies increasingly unreliable. Alfonso V, who had never had the aggressive instinct that the situation required, began looking for a way to disengage. He went to France to appeal personally to Louis XI. Louis XI, who had been watching the war with the cold calculation of a man who backed winners, looked at what the Battle of Toro had done to Alfonso's political position and told him, politely but clearly, that France would not be committing further resources to this particular conflict. Alfonso came back to Portugal without an army and without an ally. The war was effectively over. There is someone missing from most accounts of the War of Castilian Succession. Juana la Beltranilla, the girl whose legitimacy was disputed, whose father may or may not have been Enrique IV, who had been married to her own uncle at age 13 as a piece in a political game she had no power to influence, was 17 years old when the war ended. She had been the justification for the Portuguese invasion. She had been the name on Alfonso V's banners. She had been the prize around which 5 years of war had been organized. Nobody asked her what she wanted. The Treaty of Alcacovas, signed in September 1479, ended the war. Portugal recognized Isabel and Fernando as the rightful rulers of Castile. In exchange, Castile recognized Portuguese sovereignty over the Atlantic trade routes, the sea lanes to Africa and beyond, the routes that would become the most valuable geography in the world within a generation. It was a trade that Isabel almost certainly understood she was making at a discount, though neither she nor anyone else could yet know how costly that discount would become. Juana was given a choice. She could marry Isabel's son, the infant Juan, who was still a baby. She would have to wait. She would be kept in custody in Castile under the careful supervision of the woman who had spent 5 years fighting her claim to the throne. Or she could enter a convent. In May 1479, before the treaty was even signed, Juana announced her desire to take the veil. The chroniclers record this as a voluntary decision. History has been less certain. A 17-year-old girl, alone in a foreign country, with the war lost and her supporters scattered, and the woman who had defeated her now offering two options, neither of which were anything a 17-year-old girl would have chosen for herself. The decision to choose the convent does not look entirely free from a distance of 5 centuries. Juana spent the rest of her life in a Portuguese convent. She lived until 1530. She called herself Queen of Castile until she died. Isabel never acknowledged the claim. September 1479. The Treaty of Alcacovas was signed. The war was over. Isabel was 28 years old. She had been queen for 5 years, at war for almost all of them, governing a kingdom in the middle of a conflict that she had not started and could not afford to lose. She had funded the war by taking the church's silver and promising to return it. She had moved her court across Castile on horseback in winter. She had been pregnant. She had managed the nobility with a combination of negotiation and threat that had kept enough of them loyal enough for enough of the time. She had won. But winning had a cost that the Chronicles record with unusual honesty. The treasury was exhausted. The nobility had been promised rewards for their loyalty, and rewards cost money. The infrastructure of governance, the courts, the roads, the administrative apparatus that had been neglected under Enrique IV and further disrupted by 5 years of war, needed rebuilding from the foundations. The church silver had to be repaid. The borders had to be secured. And there was the Atlantic. The Treaty of Alcacovas had given Portugal the sea lanes to Africa and the trading posts of Guinea and everything south and east of the Canary Islands. At the time, this seemed like a reasonable price for ending the war. The Canaries remained Castilian. That was something. But somewhere in the back of the mind of a woman who had spent 5 years calculating every exchange for what it cost and what it bought, a question was forming. If Portugal had the eastern sea lanes, the routes to Africa, to the spices, to the wealth that was already making Lisbon one of the richest cities in Europe, what routes were left? The question didn't have an answer yet. It would take another 13 years, a Genoese sailor with an impractical theory, and one of the most consequential decisions in human history to answer it. But the question had begun.